These are the papyrus scrolls of Herculaneum, 1,800 ancient books written on sheets of plant fiber, flash-seared by the volcanic heat.
When the first ancient Greek letters flickered onto the monitor, the researchers froze. For centuries, the Herculaneum scrolls were considered hopeless. Blackened cylinders of ash that crumbled to dust if anyone tried to touch them. Entire libraries lost forever. It was written with ink that has some metal in it, and it was also written on animal skin rather than papyrus. So the layers were a little bit more clear to be able to see when we did the scan, and the ink showed up much more readily than other kinds of ink. But now, thanks to technology more powerful than anything available even 5 years ago, the impossible was happening. Words were emerging from pure darkness. Experts called the discovery otherworldly, and they weren't exaggerating. Hidden inside a scroll burned nearly 2,000 years ago, X-ray scans revealed text that no human eyes had seen since the Roman Empire fell. And what those words say is forcing historians to question everything we thought we knew about Rome's final days, and the people who witnessed them. The scan that shouldn't have worked. Inside a sealed lab at Oxford's Diamond Light Source, a charred black cylinder, no bigger than a wine bottle, sat in the center of a machine built to pierce atoms. Around it, researchers barely spoke. For centuries, that cylinder, a papyrus scroll excavated from Herculaneum's buried villa of the papyri, had been considered a fossil of words. It was too fragile to open, too carbonized to read. But now, for the first time, light stronger than sunlight itself was about to pass through it. The team called it P-Herc 172, a code that said nothing of its history. The scroll had survived the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79. Entombed in ash at 600 degrees Fahrenheit, its contents sealed in charcoal. Every attempt to physically unroll such scrolls in the past had ended in destruction. But this time, instead of hands, it would be photons doing the work. When the first scan came through, nothing happened. The monitors displayed only static gray bands, papyrus layers flattened by time. Then, as the beam's phase was adjusted, faint shadows began to take shape. Letters, ancient Greek, symbols of disgust, fear, and life, hidden in the blackness for nearly 2,000 years. It's the first scroll where the ink could just be seen on the scan, said Dr. Michael Macassar of University College London, one of the few people alive who could identify those markings. Here's what nobody understood until that moment. For 2,000 years, experts had been looking for the wrong thing. They'd been searching for contrast, dark ink on light papyrus. But the Herculaneum scrolls had no contrast. The fire had turned everything the same shade of black. The breakthrough wasn't finding the ink. It was realizing the ink sat higher than the papyrus, elevated by microscopic fractions that only phase contrast X-rays could detect. They weren't reading color. They were reading texture. The ancient scribes had accidentally created a three-dimensional text, preserved in carbon, that could only be decoded by technology that wouldn't exist for 2 millennia. And the lettering wasn't random. It matched a known pattern, the handwriting of Philodemus, an Epicurean philosopher from the 1st century BCE, but the team held their breath before confirming it. This was only the beginning, and premature claims could ruin everything. The words they could make out so far, disgust, fear, pleasure, felt almost personal, as if the writer had been cataloging emotions rather than recording doctrine. It was philosophy written in fire. And yet buried deeper in the scroll's digital layers, the data hinted at something else, something not meant for the living to see. The next discovery proved that this was not just a philosopher's lament, but a coded record of a civilization wrestling with its own collapse. The race to read the unreadable. The Oxford breakthrough didn't happen in isolation. Thousands of miles away, A new kind of archaeological competition was unfolding. One that didn't use trowels or brushes, but algorithms. It was called the Vesuvius Challenge, a global race launched in 2023 to do what centuries of scholarship had failed to achieve. Read the unreadable. At the center of it all stood Dr. Brent Seals, a computer scientist from the University of Kentucky, who described his mission as teaching machines to see through time. His team had spent years developing techniques to virtually unwrap scrolls without unrolling them, layering X-ray scans and artificial intelligence to trace faint letters on the inner spirals. Every dataset looked like chaos, waves of crushed papyrus twisted together like smoke. But Seals believed order was hiding inside. Then in late 2024, 3 students from different continents did something no classical scholar had managed in 2,000 years. Using deep learning algorithms, they detected over 2,000 ancient Greek letters inside one of the unopened scrolls. Not fragments, not guesses, complete readable text. They won the Vesuvius Challenge's $700,000 grand prize. But more importantly, they proved the scrolls could talk. All of the technological progress has happened in the last 3 to 5 years, said papyrologist Michael McCosser. On the timescales of classicists, that's unbelievable. The words that emerged weren't random. Bios, phobos, hedon, life, fear, pleasure. The same themes, the same emotional language. The AI flagged it immediately. These scrolls were connected. Someone had deliberately grouped these texts together, storing reflections on human nature alongside records of human destruction. And yet, the algorithms noticed something else. A pattern in the spacing, the rhythm, even the pressure of the strokes. It was as though someone had structured the text to conceal something deeper, something meant only for readers far in the future. What emerged from the findings was that the Charred Herculaneum scroll is more than text. Its intent, its design. Someone wanted future generations to find this. The next stage of decoding would expose the author behind those haunting words. A philosopher whose ideas about vice and virtue had survived not by luck, but by something closer to defiance. The Philosopher in the Ash. The name appeared faintly at first, a pattern of Greek letters half swallowed by static. But when the data was reconstructed and virtually unrolled, the X-ray scans made it clear. Philodemus. The signature belonged to one of antiquity's most elusive thinkers, an Epicurean philosopher who lived in the 1st century BCE and taught that pleasure was the foundation of a good life. His words had been silent for nearly 2 millennia. Now, through a beam of light and lines of code, he was speaking again. Nobody knew what it was about. We didn't even know if it had writing on it, said Dr. McCosser, recalling the moment the author's name was detected on the Oxford scroll. The text identified within the Charred Herculaneum scroll matched the first volume of On Vices, a 10-book exploration of human flaws such as greed, arrogance, flattery, and disgust. To Philodemus, vice wasn't sin. It was imbalance, a distortion of human nature. He wrote of self-control, friendship, and the dangers of excess in an empire that worshipped both wealth and power. This was not merely philosophy. It was psychology centuries ahead of its time. Every emotion described, greed, arrogance, flattery, disgust, echoed the moral collapse of the Rome surrounding him. The words disgust and fear, visible on the X-ray images, struck modern researchers as eerily contemporary. They weren't detached or theoretical. They were visceral, human, and yet the tone unnerved them. These weren't the words of someone writing for an audience. They wrote like they knew they were already dead, like they were not humans bound by time. The text read like a warning. Why was Phyllis's exploration of moral decay preserved in a private library belonging to Lucius Calpurnius Piso, father-in-law of Julius Caesar? Why did these sensitive ideas sit hidden alongside luxurious scrolls in the same villa that entertained the most powerful family in the Republic. Scholars began to suspect the villa of the papyri was more than a home. It was a repository for political, philosophical, and dangerous knowledge. What X-ray scans reveal about the Charred Herculaneum scroll is that its author was writing in a world already fracturing, where knowledge could serve as both wisdom and weapon. And as scientists decoded more fragments, another voice began to surface from the ashes, one not concerned with human weakness, but with history itself. The next discovery would shatter the idea that the Herculaneum scrolls were purely philosophical, revealing a text so politically charged that it had been buried with the empire it described. The discovery that shouldn't exist. The next scroll didn't speak of emotion or virtue, it spoke of war. When researchers fed the new scans through their reconstruction software, they expected more of Philodemus, perhaps another fragment from his moral writings. Instead, what appeared on their screens were unfamiliar Latin sequences. The words Bellorum Civilium of the Civil Wars repeated through the data woven into what looked like an eyewitness account of political unrest. At first, scholars thought it must be a copist's note or a later edition, but the ink composition and script style matched the period of the late Republic. Then came the signature, Seneca. The revelation sent a shock through the academic world. For centuries, historians had believed that Seneca the Elder's most ambitious work, Historiae Abinio Bellorum Civilium, history from the beginning of the Civil Wars, was completely lost. Only scattered references survived, suggesting it once chronicled the violent transition from republic to empire. Now, the X-ray scans of a charred Herculaneum scroll had just unearthed fragments of it, hidden within the same villa that preserved Philodemus's ethics. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a pattern. Think about the timing. Seneca the Elder lived through the Civil Wars, witnessed the Republic's collapse, and wrote it all down. But his history vanished from the historical record completely. Not a single complete copy survived anywhere in the Roman world. That level of erasure doesn't happen by accident. Histories get lost through neglect or fire. They get erased through intention. Yet somehow one copy survived, hidden in the private library of Caesar's father-in-law, in a villa that would be buried before anyone could remove it. If Vesuvius hadn't erupted, this text might have been destroyed deliberately. The pace is ramping up very quickly. Macassar said, "Everything we're getting from the Herculaneum library is new to us." As AI began to piece together the fractured lines, a picture emerged. A detailed commentary on Rome's descent into chaos, written by a man who had witnessed it. The passages described not myths or philosophy, but strategy, betrayal, and blood. Names appeared, generals, senators, conspirators, some unknown in any surviving text. To historians, this was unthinkable. Lost histories don't simply reappear. 2,000 years later in a scan. And yet here they were, coherent, datable, and verified. The charred papyrus had outlasted the empire it described. What X-ray scans reveal about the charred Herculaneum scroll isn't just the recovery of text. It's the recovery of perspective, voices that official history had silenced. If Philodemus recorded how humans behave when they lose their moral compass, Seneca the Elder was documenting what happens when nations do. Both men working under the same roof had captured Rome's collapse from opposite sides of the human condition. One philosophical, one historical, and that overlap was no accident. As researchers examined where these scrolls were found, they began to suspect that the Villa of the Papi wasn't merely a residence. It was a vault designed to preserve a truth too dangerous for its time. The villa that watched Rome burn, the Villa of the Papyri, wasn't just any Roman estate. It belonged to Lucius Calpurnius Piso, father-in-law of Julius Caesar, a man at the center of Rome's most dangerous political moment. When archaeologists first discovered it in the 18th century, they found nearly 1,800 papyrus scrolls. the only library from antiquity ever to survive intact. But here's what made researchers pause. This wasn't a random collection. Philosophical texts like Philodemus on Vices sat directly beside political histories like Seneca's Lost Chronicle. Moral analysis next to military strategy, personal ethics alongside accounts of civil war. It was deliberate. Someone had built an archive that showed both why Rome collapsed and how it happened. The lost Roman history was hidden in these pages deliberately. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79 turned the villa into a tomb. A 600-degree blast of superheated gas swept through the halls, instantly carbonizing everything organic, destroying and preserving in the same moment. For centuries, those charred cylinders mocked every attempt at translation. They looked like stones, not books. And yet, they held the memory of a civilization. Now the pattern becomes clear. Piso wasn't just collecting philosophy for leisure. He was documenting the Republic's implosion in real time. His son-in-law was reshaping Rome through force. His library was capturing the moral decay that made it possible. Philosophy as evidence, history as confession. Was this library meant to be a warning or proof of what really happened? Preserved for a future that might ask the right questions. Today, more than half the site remains buried under volcanic debris. Ground-penetrating surveys show chambers still sealed, rooms untouched since the day Vesuvius erupted. And it's there, in those unopened depths, that researchers believe the next scans could reveal something even more extraordinary. The Charred Herculaneum scroll discovery isn't just about what it says, but where it was found. This villa didn't merely witness the fall of Rome's moral order. It contained the evidence of it. The scrolls didn't just survive 2,000 years of volcanic heat and pressure. They resisted destruction. The next discovery would prove this wasn't preservation by accident. It was a system. And the proof was hidden in the ash itself. Patterns in the ash. Music. At first, the scan seemed to reveal only text, ancient ink recovered from darkness. But as the algorithms refined, new data began to surface between the letters themselves. There were patterns, invisible signatures embedded in the material structure of the scrolls. By comparing multiple Herculaneum papyri, including Perk 172, researchers noticed variations so slight they could only be measured in microns. Phase contrast tomography exposed differences in handwriting stroke depth and angle, subtle enough to identify the work of multiple scribes. We were suddenly able to tell when one hand stopped and another began, said Dr. Vito Macella of Italy's National Research Council. These differences weren't decorative. They were chronological. Some scrolls could now be dated to between 75 and 50 BCE, decades before others in the same archive. Then came the chemical anomalies. Advanced imaging picked up traces of metallic elements, tiny residues of lead in the ink of certain scrolls, but not others. Lead wasn't a normal ingredient in Roman carbon ink. Its presence suggested either a special composition for high-status manuscripts or an intentional method to make specific texts stand out under the light. When scientists fed these measurements into AI clustering models, the results were startling. Scrolls containing Philodemus's moral treatises grouped alongside fragments of political commentary and historical narrative, suggesting a shared origin. The software had unintentionally mapped a network. Philosophers, historians, and copists, all working under the same patronage. That patron was almost certainly Lucius Calpurnius Piso, the villa's owner and Caesar's father-in-law. Piso was known to fund scholars, poets, and statesmen, his estate functioning as both retreat and research center. The X-ray data confirmed what no historian could have proven before. The Villa of the Papi operated as an organized archive where the moral analysis of vice and the factual record of civil war were preserved together as a unified account of Rome's unraveling. The data has proven that the Charred Herculaneum scrolls don't just record events. They record the people who recorded them. These traces of hands and ink show deliberate preservation, even curation, as though someone understood that the empire's story might one day need to be recovered from ash. And when the fragments aligned into a single voice, for the first time in 2,000 years, Rome began to speak again. The moment Rome spoke again. The reconstructed text began as scattered phrases, then line by line took form. What X-ray scans revealed about the Charred Herculaneum scroll at this stage wasn't just restoration. It was resurrection. Across multiple scrolls, repeated phrases emerged. Bellorum Civilium of the Civil Wars and Caesaris Concilia, Caesar's plans. Cross-referencing them produced a startling match. The syntax, vocabulary, and structure aligned with known citations of Seneca the Healer's Lost Chronicle, Histori Ionitio Bellorum Civilium, History, from the beginning of the Civil Wars. This was the lost Roman history, a primary account of the Republic's implosion, written by a man who lived through it. The discovery reframed everything. The moral treatises of Philodemus were no longer isolated philosophy, but context and ethical lens for the events Seneca described. The recovered sections depict the atmosphere before Caesar's coup, fear in the Senate, moral compromise among generals, and an empire slowly turning on itself. Unlike later imperial histories, these passages are unfiltered, written before hindsight, when the future was still uncertain. They name figures omitted from surviving records, imply political motives erased by the winners of history, and offer a perspective Rome never intended to preserve. The X-ray scans didn't just recover text. They solved the puzzle of why this library existed. Piso's villa wasn't a place of leisure. It was an early attempt to document the collapse of Rome from within, storing philosophy beside history to show both cause and consequence. Artificial intelligence models continue to reconstruct damaged layers. But already the narrative is clear. Greed, flattery, and arrogance, the vices warned against, become the motives driving the wars Seneca recorded. The moral decay of individuals mirrored the downfall of the Republic. Artificial intelligence models continue to reconstruct damaged layers. But already the narrative is clear. Greed, flattery, arrogance, the vices warned against, were not abstractions. They were symptoms of something far deeper. Among the reconstructed words, certain Greek terms repeat with unsettling consistency. Bios, life itself. Phobos, fear. Hedon, pleasure. Li, sorrow. Epithemia, desire. Each word is more than a fragment. It's a moral diagnosis. Bios in Philodemus's philosophy was the measure of a life lived rightly. Disciplined, balanced, guided by reason. But in the recovered lines, bios is shadowed by phobos, the fear that corrodes judgment. Senators feared losing status more than they feared losing virtue. Generals feared irrelevance more than defeat. Fear became the architect of ambition. Then comes hedon pleasure. Once the Epicurean pursuit of peace and simplicity, it mutates here into indulgence, luxury masquerading as culture, appetite replacing honor. The text pairs hedon with life, sorrow, suggesting that pleasure without measure always ends in emptiness. The Romans, Philodemus implies, were not undone by poverty or war, but by the hunger to feel something beyond fear. And beneath it all runs epithea, desire, the most dangerous of all. It drives men to conquer, to flatter, to betray. In the recovered phrases, Seneca's chronicle echoes this same theme. Desire no longer for virtue, but for spectacle, not for order, but for dominance. It is as if both writers, philosopher and historian, were describing the same disease from opposite sides of the same wound. Together, these words sketch the anatomy of Rome's collapse. Bios without virtue, phobos without courage, hedon without restraint, life without reflection, epithea without purpose, a society where philosophy had become decoration and morality a performance. The scrolls make the connection brutally clear.
The wars of ambition that Seneca chronicled were not accidents of power, but the inevitable outcome of inner decay. The Republic fell not because enemies stormed its gates, but because fear, desire, and pleasure had already conquered its soul. Echoes beneath the ash. Even after 2 millennia beneath volcanic rubble, the voices of Herculaneum have not been silenced. This year alone, researchers scanned 18 additional scrolls from the Villa of the Papi, with dozens more queued for the European Synrotron radiation facility. Each scan powered by Synrotron X-rays and AI-driven virtual unrolling promises fragments of words that haven't been read for 2,000 years. Letters emerge like shadows across the charred surfaces, revealing moral reflections, political intrigues, and personal anxieties preserved by chance or perhaps by design. Every revelation pushes the limits of what historians once assumed possible. Beyond the technical triumph, there's a profound human element. Philodemus's philosophical musings still warn against arrogance and excess. Seneca the Elder's historical records illuminate Roman power struggles that were thought lost forever. And woven through the charred layers, researchers are detecting traces of unknown authors, fragments of thought that may never have belonged to anyone recorded in surviving history. It's as if the scrolls themselves resisted destruction, leaving behind a silent testament to a civilization determined to speak, even from beneath the ash. The writers, Philus, Seneca, and the others, they were not humans writing for pleasure or to be remembered. They were writing warnings out of love for a world they saw in danger. And now that their words are finally being read, it's up to us to act accordingly. If fire preserved their words once, what else lies hidden beneath layers of ash and stone? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next.